Good evening, and welcome to the Midnight Inquiry, your guide to cozy dreams and just maybe a bit of learning along the way. Tonight we'll be talking about the bloop, a sound so strange, so loud, and so unexplained it sent ripples through both the ocean and the imaginations of millions. Before we get settled, please take a moment to like and subscribe so I can reach other sleepless souls like you. And if you could, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. Now, let's begin our journey. In the waning decades of the 20th century, while politicians stood behind podiums and citizens hunched nervously under the weight of mutually assured destruction, the United States government was quietly weaving an invisible net beneath the oceans. This net, known officially as the Sound Surveillance System, SOSUS, was a sprawling network of hydrophones placed strategically along the ocean floor, strung between continental shelves, slinking through the dark channels of the sea like the sensory tendrils of some great beast. Its purpose was unambiguous: to listen for the stealthy hum of Soviet submarines as they glided silently through the deep, loaded with nuclear payloads and dread. SOSUS was a Cold War instrument, a seismograph for human paranoia, tuned not to earthquakes or whales, but to propellers and ballast shifts and the subtle mechanical heartbeats of distant enemies. Its existence was highly classified, and for decades it fed an unbroken stream of sonic information to analysts who strained to parse friend from foe, biological from mechanical, echo from engine. But when the Iron Curtain began to fray and the old ghosts of the Cold War slowly lost their teeth, the vast and expensive infrastructure of SOSUS found itself caught in an existential question. What now? What does a surveillance network do when there's no longer anything to surveil? In a rare moment of institutional imagination, the answer was science. Rather than mothball the system, portions of SOSUS were handed over to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, and their team of oceanographers, geophysicists and acoustic researchers who saw in this aging relic of espionage a new frontier for discovery. With the flick of a bureaucratic pen, the instruments of war were quietly repurposed for peace, and in the early 1990s, NOAA began using the hydrophones to listen not for enemies, but for the Earth itself. They listened for the long, grinding collapse of ice shelves, for the bubbling eruptions of undersea volcanoes, for the rhythmic cries of whales, for the deep groans of tectonic plates sliding past each other with the patience of millennia. What they heard was a symphony, an ever-playing, never-ending composition of geological and biological song, and for a time the work was methodical, even routine. Until one summer day in 1997, something unexpected echoed through the abyss. It was low, it was loud, and it was completely unfamiliar. A series of blooping, upward-sweeping tones that rose in pitch like the digital yawn of some submerged leviathan, too large and too far away to identify, but loud enough to be picked up by hydrophones stationed more than 3,000 miles apart. It had originated somewhere in the southeastern Pacific Ocean, in a stretch of open water that lay eerily close to the so-called Point Nemo, a location so remote that the nearest human beings were typically those orbiting overhead aboard the International Space Station. The scientists, intrigued and slightly baffled, did what scientists do. They triangulated the signal, logged its properties, compared it to their existing sound libraries, and tried to slot it neatly into a known category. But it didn't fit. It wasn't seismic. It wasn't volcanic. It didn't sound like ice carving or shelf cracking. It had a profile that looked, quite startlingly, like a biological signature. But no known animal, not even the mighty blue whale, could generate a sound so loud or that could travel so far. The volume alone was enough to make some researchers furrow their brows in disbelief. It wasn't just loud, it was colossal. If it were organic, then whatever had made it would have to be orders of magnitude larger than any creature ever documented. And yet, there was no evidence, no sightings, no carcasses, no accompanying sonar hits, just the sound. And so, in a moment that would echo louder than the signal itself, someone, perhaps half-jokingly, dubbed it the Bloop. The name was disarmingly childish, almost whimsical, like something out of a cartoon. But underneath the levity lurked something primal, something that stirred in the lizard brain of everyone who heard the clip. It was not just an anomaly, it was a reminder that we have not tamed this world, that there are corners, vast, cold, crushing, black corners, where our maps fade into artistic guesswork and our instruments listen to ghosts. The Bloop captured public imagination almost immediately. Though the recording was initially buried in academic circles, it leaked into the internet in the early 2000s and spread like a virus. It became the subject of message board speculation, of cable television specials, of science fiction novels and creepypastas and cryptozoological fever dreams. People compared it to the calls of enormous whales, theorized about ancient sea monsters, speculated about secret government experiments gone wrong, even tied its location to the fictional coordinates of R'lyeh, the sunken city of H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu. The ocean, which had once been a place of data and charts and graphs, suddenly became mythic again. The mystery of the Bloop was not just that we didn't know what made it, but that we wanted it to be something marvelous, something terrifying, something beyond. In many ways, the story of the Bloop is not really about acoustics or marine biology or Cold War leftovers. It's a story about the tension between what we know and what we hope for. It's about the way our minds bend around the unknown, trying to give it shape, trying to dress it in narratives we can understand. It's about our profound discomfort with ambiguity and our equally profound need for wonder. And perhaps most haunting of all, it's a story about silence. Because after 1997, the Bloop was never heard again. It did not repeat. It did not evolve. It simply happened, and then was gone, like a whisper in a vast cathedral, like a dream forgotten moments after waking. And we are left here, at the surface, with our headphones and our guesses, straining to understand what, if anything, down there was trying to speak. The ocean is not a place of silence. It is in fact a place of song, a fluid cathedral where pressure and vibration dance in eternal, unseen patterns, and sound becomes not just a tool for communication, but the primary method of navigation, awareness, and connection across crushing distances and depths where light can barely reach. And if the ocean is a cathedral, then somewhere deep within it lies the aisle down which all these songs travel, the deep sound channel, also known as the SOFAR channel, a natural physics-born highway that cuts invisibly through the ocean like a whispering wind tunnel. It's a narrow horizontal layer of water where conditions align just right, where the temperature and pressure of the ocean hit a perfect balance point, allowing sound waves to travel not hundreds, but thousands of kilometers without dissipating. To understand why, we have to briefly consider how sound behaves in water and what the ocean really is. Not a uniform mass of blue wetness, but a layered, shifting, stratified body with its own internal weather. As you descend into the ocean, temperature drops and pressure rises, and both these variables affect the speed at which sound moves. In warmer, shallower water, sound travels faster, but it also spreads and attenuates quickly. In colder, deeper water, the speed decreases, but the pressure compresses the sound and funnels it more efficiently. Somewhere in the middle, usually between 600 and 1,200 meters deep depending on location, these opposing factors meet and cancel each other out. That's the so far channel. Sound waves generated within or near this channel are trapped there by the physics of their own medium. If they try to rise, they hit warmer, faster waters and bend back down. If they fall, they meet colder, slower layers and curve back up. The result is a kind of audio waveguide, a resonant tunnel that hugs the curvature of the Earth and allows sound to travel with astonishing efficiency. In the open ocean, a low-frequency noise like a whale song or an iceberg cracking can bounce along the so far channel and be heard clear across a basin. For humans, this discovery was revolutionary. During World War II and later in the Cold War, military scientists realized they could exploit this quirk of physics to eavesdrop on distant submarines and maritime activities without needing eyes or radar. It was a way to turn the very nature of the sea against those who sought to hide in it, and so in secret they laid down hydrophones across the ocean floor, discrete microphones housed in pressure-resistant casings dropped into the shadowy thresholds of this acoustic tunnel. The network they formed, SOSUS, was enormous, spanning continents, carefully triangulated, fed into secure Navy listening stations, and for years it did its job. It listened. But what it listened to was not only enemy submarines. It heard the throb of ship propellers, yes, and the slow churn of ballast tanks adjusting depth, but also the haunting wails of blue whales migrating across hemispheres, the sudden cracks of underwater earthquakes, the groans of glaciers carving into frigid sea. It heard nature in all her moods, indifferent and vast and unspeakably loud. When this technology was eventually repurposed for civilian science, NOAA took the reins and began to systematically log the ocean's great acoustic diary. They discovered that the sea never sleeps, that every moment something somewhere is booming or cracking or singing beneath the waves. Sound became a kind of omnipresent truth, a medium that spoke louder and more persistently than light, than currents, than temperature. And in this wide, restless symphony, there were sometimes notes that didn't belong, unidentified harmonics, mystery pulses, sudden rumbles that seemed to carry across oceans. It is in this context that the bloop makes its entrance. When it was first heard, its low-frequency rumble swept through this natural tunnel of the sea, triggering sensors thousands of kilometers apart. That it was heard so clearly and so widely was not merely because it was loud, though it was, but because it travelled through this ancient invisible corridor, carved not by hand but by the basic, relentless laws of thermodynamics. The bloop did not knock on our door. It was carried to it, ferried like a secret down a dark hallway built into the sea itself, and that is why its mystery endured, because we could hear it, clearly, definitively, over enormous distances, and yet could not find it. Because the so far channel, while it helps us listen, does not help us see. It delivers the ghost without the ghost story. It lets us hear the breath of something immense, without ever glimpsing its face. That is the paradox of the deep sound channel. It amplifies knowledge, but deepens mystery. It tells us where something is, but not what. It is both our flashlight and our blindfold, and so the bloop, born of sound, became a legend of silence. Not because we lacked the means to hear it, but because the very structure that let us hear it, this cold, perfect tunnel through the sea, was the same one that kept it so far away, so remote, so tantalizingly beyond our grasp. It began, as so many strange things do, with something so ordinary it nearly passed unnoticed. A technician reviewing data in a sterile office filled with grey monitors and the persistent hum of machines, just another day logged in the annals of acoustic surveillance. Another sound clip added to the endless stream of oceanic ambience. It was the summer of 1997, a year brimming with cultural noise and analogue echoes, before the internet truly became a second planet, before mysteries could trend worldwide in seconds, when things still had to travel through word of mouth and scanned magazine clippings, through murmured curiosity and backrooms of academia and slow-loading message boards. The world was noisy above the surface. Princess Diana's funeral broadcast across continents, Titanic devouring box office records like a leviathan in its own right, the Mars Pathfinder crawling across red soil and beaming home images that made children want telescopes again. But far beneath the surface, in a region of the world where even the fish live in eternal twilight, a very different kind of noise had just made itself known. In the southeastern Pacific Ocean, not far from the absolute centre of aquatic nowhere, an area so far from land it is sometimes called the oceanic pole of inaccessibility, Point Nemo, a place so absurdly remote that spacecraft are routinely crashed there because there's less chance of hitting a ship than of hitting an alien. Hydrophones began to buzz with something unexpected, something big. The sound was faint at first, just another anomaly in a sea of anomalies, but it had a curious shape to it, rising in frequency with a kind of gentle but insistent curve, a slow pitch up like a bloop, bloop, bloop reverberating through the deep, not mechanical, not sudden like a quake, but organic in shape and yet too enormous to be from any known organism. It wasn't until the same sound was picked up by sensors over 3,000 miles apart that the red flags began to wave. Not out of fear or urgency, but that distinct chill of scientific curiosity, the kind that makes researchers lean back in their chairs and murmur, "Now what the hell is that?" These were not old military spooks anymore, but marine scientists, oceanographers, and acoustic analysts from NOAA's Pacific Marine Environmental Laboratory, a quiet cadre of deep-sea listeners whose jobs were not to interpret the sound of war, but the soundtrack of a living planet. When they plotted the signal's origin, they traced it to somewhere between New Zealand and the southern tip of South America, an abyssal, lonely stretch of ocean marked by underwater ridges, seamounts, and tectonic scars that rarely saw attention unless a geologist had reason to look. There was nothing there. No known seismic activity, no iceberg drift paths, no migratory hotspots for massive marine life, just water. And beneath it, thousands of feet of darkness pressing down like a collapsed cathedral. The recording was nicknamed, with the kind of casual brilliance that tends to stick in memory, the bloop, a term that, while scientifically unserious, had the strange power of language to strip fear from the unfamiliar and replace it with something almost adorable. The bloop, It sounded like a comic book noise, something you'd hear when a cartoon fish got bonked on the head. But the sound itself was anything but silly. It was low frequency, persistent, and powerful, loud enough that it travelled through the Sofar Channel across vast reaches of the Pacific Basin, powerful enough that its source would need to be orders of magnitude louder than the call of a blue whale, which was, up until that moment, the undisputed heavyweight champion of biological acoustics. And yet it wasn't just the volume that startled the researchers, it was the acoustic profile. When the sound was graphed, it looked familiar, biological. That was the word used in early internal memos. Not tectonic, not volcanic, not artificial, biological. But no known creature could possibly account for it, unless we were willing to entertain the idea that something existed in the deep that not only dwarfed every known marine animal, but could also cry out in such a way that the very earth seemed to bend and carry its voice like an offering to the distant shores of every continent that bothered to listen. And so the questions began, not just from within Noe, but from those on the periphery who caught wind of the anomaly and felt its gravity pulling at their imaginations. What had made the sound? Why there? Why only that summer? And why had it never been heard again? In the early days, these questions had few listeners outside of the small world of underwater acoustics, a world that straddled the lines between geology, biology, physics, and mystery. But soon, as fragments of the story leaked beyond the walls of Noah, especially after a 2002 article by David Wolman in Wired magazine gave the tale its first real burst of cultural oxygen, the Bloop began to take on a life of its own. And back in that moment, in the actual summer of 1997, before the theorizing and documentaries and speculation and monster memes, there was just the data, a series of graphs showing frequency curves and decibel levels, a digital recording that, to the untrained ear, might have sounded like distant plumbing or a mistuned modem, but that to those who studied the ocean sounded like a question that the sea itself had asked. One of the most interesting things about that summer in retrospect is how unceremoniously the discovery was treated at first. There was no panic, no press release, no massive declaration of scientific wonder. Just careful documentation, cataloguing and storage in a growing archive of unexplained underwater phenomena. NOAA scientists are not, generally speaking, in the business of jumping to conclusions. They work in a field where ambiguity is the rule, not the exception. Ice cracks, plates shift, whales bellow, methane clathrates pop like champagne corks beneath the continental shelves. The ocean is, at all times, full of noise, but even by those chaotic standards, the Bloop stood out like a scream in a room full of whispers, and for those listening that summer, it must have felt like being the first to hear thunder on a day the sky was perfectly clear. Something had called out from the deep, and the world had not yet noticed, but it would, slowly, inevitably. Through the echo chambers of scientific journals, then the louder hallways of speculative media, and finally the global synapses of the internet, where mystery spreads like blood in water. But before any of that happened, there was just the sound. Just that strange, unplaceable warble rising through miles of ocean. Just a few stunned scientists sitting in modest offices with headphones on, staring at data they couldn't explain, and trying not to let their minds drift to places that science didn't usually let them go. Places filled with shadows, with legends, with monsters large enough to shake the sea, By the time scientists realized what they had recorded, the bloop had already completed its journey. It had reverberated silently through the deep for less than a minute, yet its acoustic footprint stretched like a ghost's echo across more than 5,000 kilometers of open water, touching listening stations scattered across the Pacific Basin like an uninvited but unmistakable guest. And this, perhaps more than anything else, is what set the bloop apart. Not just the strangeness of the sound itself, not just its uncertain origin, but its reach. It was heard by hydrophones near the coast of South America, picked up near Hawaii, traced through stations thousands of miles apart, as though the ocean itself had conspired to carry this strange signature from one set of ears to the next. The sheer magnitude of what that implies cannot be overstated. This was not a sound like a rock falling into water, a crack, a splash, a thud. It was vast, subtle, yes, but unmistakably loud in that special way things in the ocean can be. Deep, rolling, omnipresent, as if it didn't come from a place so much as it was the place, as if it was the voice of the water itself shifting in its sleep. If you had the right equipment, and the people at NOAA did, it would have sounded less like a noise and more like a phenomenon, a bloom of sound, a sonic vent. Its pitch was low, dipping into frequencies that skirt the edge of human perception, too bassy for our ears to comprehend directly but easily captured by the sensitive hydrophones NOAA had deployed through the legacy infrastructure of SOSUS. And that sound, a rising moan, a curved swell in the acoustic profile, was recorded over and over by sensors spread across an area larger than the continental United States. To understand the power of this, one must understand just how quickly most sound dissipates in the ocean. Unlike in air, sound in water travels faster and farther, but only if it's low enough in frequency to slip through the deep sound channel without scattering. Even then, most natural noises die off quickly. An undersea landslide might be picked up by a few nearby sensors. A volcanic tremor might be heard a few hundred kilometers away, if at all. But the bloop rolled across the Pacific like a foghorn amplified by the abyss. If it had been created at the surface by an explosion or a shipwreck or the carving of an iceberg, it would have shown up clearly as a higher frequency broadband event. But it didn't. Its signature was clean, curved, distinct. Whatever had made it did so in the deep, very deep, far below the storm-churned upper layers of the ocean, in the crushing stillness where light dies and pressure builds like the weight of ancient gods. And it did so with strength that, even today, defies easy explanation. The volume of the bloop has been estimated to be several decibels above the background oceanic noise level, meaning it had to be extremely powerful to rise above the constant din of the sea, waves, storms, marine life, geological rumblings, all of it, and stand out like a siren call in the dark. NOAA's researchers did what they were trained to do. They logged the time, date, and coordinates. They fed the sound through spectral analysis software, visualized the waveform, examined the pitch curve, looked for anomalies. What they found only deepened the mystery. The waveform looked biological. That was the first thing that stuck out. Not in a way that matched anything in the existing catalogue of known marine animals, but in its structure, its rhythm, its rise and fall. It lacked the chaotic, irregular profile of geological activity. It didn't show the long, slow tremors of a quake or the rapid, percussive bursts of volcanic activity. It looked, quite eerily, like a call. But a call from what? There were no ships nearby, no known tests or underwater detonations in the region. No whale, no matter how large or ancient, could project a call that powerful across that much ocean. And yet the software didn't lie, nor did the triangulation. The source appeared to be somewhere near 50 degrees south, 100 degrees west, roughly 1,500 kilometers west of the southern coast of Chile, in a region of the Pacific so vast and unremarkable, it's often ignored entirely on commercial maps. This area, later associated with Point Nemo, has long been a kind of symbolic nowhere. The point on Earth farthest from any landmass, the maritime version of the desert, a place so isolated that the dead satellites humanity deorbits from space, are often sent there to rest, splashing down into an indifferent grave where no one will ever find them. And it was there, in the one place humans are least likely to be listening, that the bloop was born. It is both ironic and telling that the sound travelled so far that it ended up becoming one of the most heard unexplained noises in recorded ocean history. A single sound under a minute long, picked up by dozens of stations and later studied by hundreds of scientists and analysts. The fact that it was so detectable made it instantly unique. Most underwater sounds, especially of natural origin, are transient, subtle, local. But this sound demanded to be noticed. It was not polite. It did not ask for attention. It took it. And what followed, years later, after the sound became public knowledge, was a wave of fascination, speculation, mythologizing, and outright storytelling that transformed a single anomalous noise into an oceanic legend. But before the speculation came the facts. And the facts, at least as they were initially understood, were these. In the summer of 1997, NOAA recorded a low-frequency, extremely powerful sound that originated from a remote section of the southeastern Pacific Ocean. It lasted less than a minute. It was heard by sensors over 5,000 kilometers apart. It bore some structural resemblance to biological sounds, but came from a source far too large to be any known marine creature. No accompanying surface activity, sonar pings or visual anomalies were recorded. The sound never repeated. It has never been conclusively explained. That's it. That's the core of the Bloop mystery. Just a handful of data points, a recording, a spectral graph, and yet from those fragments an entire mythos would emerge. But in 1997, no one was thinking about that yet. There were no horror stories, no digital renderings of leviathans, no podcasts or documentaries, just a sound. And in the sterile analysis rooms of NOAA's marine environmental laboratories, people sat with their headphones on, listening to something that had come from a place where no one lived, no one travelled, and no one had ever heard anything like it before. This sound heard round the Pacific, a whisper from the void, a question flung into the stillness of the sea, waiting, perhaps still waiting for an answer. If you want to find something in the ocean, you don't look, you listen. You listen with a kind of reverent patience, the same way a stargazer waits for a comet, or a codebreaker stares at static waiting for a pattern to emerge. In the case of the Bloop, the only clues we had to work with were not photographic, not visual, not tactile, or even chemical. All we had was sound. A blooming, rising, almost comically named reverberation that, for less than a minute, echoed through one of the most remote aquatic regions on the planet. And yet, in that minute, it was heard, distinctly, clearly, unignorably, by hydrophones stationed thousands of kilometers apart. The very thing that made the bloop so strange was also what made it so traceable. Sound in the ocean behaves in peculiar, almost magical ways. Unlike light, which is easily swallowed by depth and distance, sound in the right frequency range can curve and arc, bending back toward the seabed and bouncing through the deep sound channel like a whisper being passed through cupped hands. So, when the bloop thundered, or perhaps more accurately, moaned from somewhere in the Pacific, it didn't just ring in one place, it rang in many. And from those multiple points of contact, NOAA scientists were able to do what scientists always hope to do when faced with the unknown: triangulate. The principle is simple in theory, but infinitely complex in practice. If a sound reaches one hydrophone, that's interesting. If it reaches two, that's useful. But if it reaches three or more, especially at precise and distinct times, then you can begin to draw circles, great invisible arcs of possibility, on the map of the ocean, narrowing down where the origin must have been. It's the same method that emergency services use when trying to locate a cell phone call bouncing off towers. It's geometry applied to echoes. In the case of the bloop, at least 5 different hydrophone stations registered the sound. These were not commercial recorders or fishing boat sonar buoys, but highly sensitive underwater microphones, relics of Cold War paranoia repurposed for planetary listening. When the data was compiled, a rough origin point emerged, around 50 degrees south latitude and 100 degrees west longitude, far from any shipping lane, outpost or known geophysical hotspot. This location, which quickly became the epicenter of speculation, sits in a region of the Pacific Ocean that is perhaps best described by what it lacks. No islands, no significant currents, no military bases, no seismic anomalies. Just open water. A blue expanse so empty of human interference that it's sometimes called the spacecraft cemetery, where decommissioned satellites and failed space probes are deliberately deorbited to fall into the sea without endangering any population. This region is so remote that the nearest humans are often aboard the International Space Station rather than on any landmass. It is, quite literally, the most isolated place on the surface of the Earth, and it was there, exactly there, that the bloop was born. The irony of this is almost poetic. The most mysterious sound ever recorded came not from a site of turmoil or tectonic tension, but from the most silent, still and unclaimed stretch of ocean on the planet. And yet, when scientists mark that point on the map, they did so with a kind of hesitance, because narrowing down where the sound came from did absolutely nothing to clarify what had made it. Triangulation gave them a coordinate, not an answer. The sea, ever the trickster, had given up just enough information to deepen the mystery without solving it. The researchers at NOAA, well versed in icequakes and subduction zones and marine mammal calls, found themselves staring at an impossible equation. There had been no major seismic events in the area. No underwater eruptions, no iceberg activity, at least none significant enough to register visually or through satellite. The signal didn't match known patterns of underwater landslides or tectonic shifts, and so they were left with a pinpointed source, but one that seemed to defy every category they had. It was like finding a footprint on the moon without a matching set of bootprints to explain how it got there. And yet, the triangulation held. They double-checked the timestamps, the delay intervals between hydrophones, the acoustic signatures' decay and curvature. It all led back to that quiet, ghostly patch of sea. And though it wasn't spoken aloud in official reports or memos, one can imagine the whispered conversations in break rooms and over beer after hours. Those moments when scientists, freed briefly from the restraint of peer review, allowed themselves to wonder what else might live out there in the great black cathedral of the deep. If you look at a map today and plot the point associated with the bloop, it doesn't show you much. No volcanoes, no obvious plate boundaries, no shipwrecks or known anomalies, just a soft, uninterrupted blue. But if you listen, if you really listen, you can still almost hear it. That rising curve of sound like something enormous stirring in its sleep. And the location, 50 degrees south, 100 degrees west, remains a kind of acoustic X on the map. A place where the sea once spoke with a voice no one recognized and then never spoke that way again. In the years that followed, this coordinate became a kind of sacred geography for those who chase mysteries. Some compared it to the fictional lull from Lovecraftian mythology, noting that Lovecraft had, with eerie proximity, described a sunken city of impossible architecture in the very same quadrant of the Pacific. Others imagined hidden tectonic features, previously uncharted abyssal plains that might shelter unknown geophysical processes. Some speculated about enormous, slow-moving creatures, rare, shy leviathans that pass through the region once every few centuries, leaving only a trail of disturbed sediment and a ripple in the soundscape. But all of this came after. In the moment, all that Noah had was a triangulated dot in the middle of nothing, and the sound of something vast moving through water in a way no one had ever heard before. And that dot, that simple, quiet coordinate, has become one of the strangest locations in modern scientific lore, not because of what we know happened there, but because of how much we still don't. It is a reminder that even with all our satellites and deep-sea probes and acoustic arrays, there are still places on this planet where the unknown not only survives, but thrives. Places where the ocean speaks in riddles and answers with silence. Places where a sound can travel for thousands of miles and still leave us no closer to its source. Places where even a perfect triangulation gives us nothing but a mystery, floating in a sea of blue. There's something quietly tragic about the bleeding edge of obscurity, the place where the full force of modern technology and institutional intellect is brought to bear not on glamorous frontiers or dazzling public spectacles, but on the quiet margins of knowledge where mystery resists resolution. It is here, in that strange overlap between precision and ignorance, that the bloop found its uneasy home. Because while it's tempting to view the bloop as a spontaneous eruption of the unknown, a sonic freak event that caught scientists off guard like a meteor striking a swimming pool, the truth is that its discovery was only made possible by decades of patient, tireless, and largely thankless work. The people who recorded the bloop weren't ghost hunters or cryptid enthusiasts, or even thrill-seeking biologists hoping to find the next colossal squid. They were researchers, government contractors, oceanographers with grant deadlines and binders full of calibration data. These were individuals who had inherited a system born from Cold War paranoia, and they had painstakingly transformed it into a tool for curiosity, for exploration, for listening to the world not in the dramatic thrum of conflict, but in the soft murmur of continuity. And in doing so, they had quietly become the stewards of one of the strangest mysteries modern science has ever recorded. Noah's acoustic monitoring program didn't just stumble into the bloop. It had been built brick by brick, frequency by frequency, with the goal of turning the world's oceans into one vast recording studio. The hydrophones, many of them former military assets, were calibrated to pick up infrasonic frequencies, tones so low they vibrate more than ring, sounds closer to the rumble of mountains than the chirp of a dolphin. These were the sounds of landslides, calving glaciers, undersea quakes, rogue waves, distant storms smashing into coastlines thousands of miles away. Every second, somewhere beneath the ocean, something was falling, groaning, shifting, collapsing, whispering. NOAA's job was to log it, categorize it, study it. They produced endless files of spectrograms, visual representations of sound showing frequency, duration, amplitude, each one a story told in waveform. Most of these stories were familiar. Iceberg collisions in Antarctica had distinct stuttering rhythms. Seismic tremors traced jagged lines through the charts. Whale calls rose and fell with haunting grace, predictable in their melancholy beauty. But every so often, every rare so often, there came something that didn't fit. Something too long, too loud, too curiously shaped. These anomalies were stored with labels that reflected their inscrutable nature. Julia, slow down, upsweep, train. And among these spectral misfits sat the Bloop, perhaps the strangest of them all, not just because of its power, but because of how normal it looked. Not like a quake, not like a machine, like a voice, a call, a sound that wanted to be heard. But within the halls of NOAA, there was no infrastructure for myth-making. No branch of the acoustic monitoring program was designated to investigate sea monsters or unexplained marine entities. Their protocols were bureaucratic, their tools methodical, their language clinical. And so, the Bloop became a line item. A sound signature catalogued alongside known geophysical events. A folder on a server, a spike on a graph. It was, in the most literal sense, filed under unidentified. This is the bleeding edge, where mystery meets a wall of protocol, where scientists, armed with the best tools human civilization has produced for eavesdropping on the planet itself, must admit without shame or hesitation that they simply do not know what something is. Not because they failed, not because they missed something, but because the world is still bigger than the tools we've built to measure it. Consider for a moment the absurdity of the situation. Humanity has launched probes to the outer planets, put rovers on Mars, peered through telescopes into the furnace-born hearts of galaxies. And yet, we cannot explain a sound that came from our own backyard. A watery backyard, yes, but still Earth, still home. The researchers who worked with these recordings often had no outlet for their wonder. There were no peer-reviewed journals where they could speculate freely about megafauna or ancient species or the biological impossibilities of the deep. If they published at all, it was in acoustics bulletins or NOAA memoranda, tucked behind walls of jargon and pages of technical analysis. And so, for years, the Bloop remained a footnote, unexplained, unresolved, but not investigated beyond the scope of its immediate acoustic characteristics. It lingered in that liminal space between curiosity and concern, a one-time event with no clear implications, no obvious follow-up, no practical consequence. And because it did not demand answers, because it did not sink a ship or breach the surface or cause a tsunami, it was, in many ways, left alone. The bleeding edge of obscurity is not a place that courts headlines. It does not cry out for funding or political attention. It is quiet. It is lonely. It is full of unanswered questions whispered into the sea. And the bloop was, for years, just another one of those whispers. But this quiet did not last forever. The bloop eventually leaked out of the scientific community. Perhaps someone shared a recording with a friend. Perhaps a journalist got hold of an internal memo. However it happened, the sound made its way into the public ear, and from that moment forward, its story was no longer in the hands of Noe. It became something else, something bigger, stranger, freer. But that part of the story comes later. First, we must linger here, at the edge, with the researchers who heard something they could not explain and were brave enough to say so. Scientists who, despite pressure to deliver certainty, filed this sound away with the humble, honest label that true science never fears: unknown. They did not call it a monster. They did not call it a hoax. They called it unexplained. And in that admission, they left a door open for us, for the dreamers, the storytellers, the late-night whisperers, for everyone who hears the soft moan of a distant sound and wonders what swims in the dark. In the wide halls of science, names are rarely poetic. They are designed to be precise, repeatable, measurable, often chosen for taxonomy or chronology, not resonance. And yet every so often, a moment of levity, or perhaps fatigue, sneaks through the curtain of seriousness, and something strange is allowed to name itself, not with dignity, but with a shrug. This is exactly what happened with the bloop. For a sound that would come to represent the modern era's most haunting maritime mystery, it was given a name that sounded like a joke. Not the deep event, not Pacific resonance anomaly, not an alphanumeric string of letters and coordinates that would wither in the memory. Number just. The bloop. A name that seemed to actively reject its own drama. A name that popped rather than echoed. That sounded like a fish burping rather than an abyss screaming. And in that irreverence, whether by accident or design, lay its staying power. The story goes that someone at NOAA, probably in the thick of data review and long shifts spent listening to ice cracks and whale songs, needed a quick file name. And once a waveform was plotted and the audio rendered into a more human-hearable range, the sound resembled to their ears a bloop, an onomatopoeic little rising chirp with an almost cartoonish quality. It was biological in shape, mysterious in scope, but in those first moments, its sheer novelty made it feel more absurd than frightening. And so, bloop it was, and bloop it remained. There was no grand naming committee, no internal debate, no press conference, just a name, typed into a file system, passed along between analysts, mentioned offhandedly in technical reports, perhaps first spoken aloud with a chuckle in the hallway between two overworked researchers. Did you hear the bloop from last week? Oh yeah, weird one. But the moment that name was used in any semi-official context, the seed was planted. Because names are power, names become symbols, and when that name eventually escaped the confines of scientific circles, when it made its way to Wired magazine, to message boards, to the early wilderness of the internet, it had already evolved from label to myth. The absurdity of the name made it more memorable, more shareable, more lovable. Had it been labelled something technical like Event 97-3 Pacific Basin Anomaly, it would have died in the footnotes. But the bloop begged to be repeated. It stuck in the mind like gum on a shoe. It sounded like a punchline, and in that disarming simplicity it became viral before viral was a word we used that way. And perhaps that was part of its success. In an era not yet saturated by constant novelty and curated fear, The bloop entered the collective consciousness like a whisper through a cracked window. The name was funny, and that humour lowered defences. People clicked the link, expecting a laugh, and what they got instead was something deeply, viscerally weird. A sound so loud it echoed across the Pacific. A source so big it defied classification. A recording so peculiar it made even the scientists behind it admit they had no clue. It was the perfect storm of naming, and in that name was hidden a brilliant irony. The sound itself was not a bloop. The actual audio in its raw form was a deep infrasonic warble, something you'd feel more than hear. A subterranean moan somewhere between a subwoofer and a tectonic groan. But when digitally compressed and played through human speakers, it took on a new form, almost comedic in its filtered clarity. And from that distortion, the name was born. But the sound was never funny. It was massive, cold, rooted in something unimaginably distant. And so the name and the nature of the bloop created a dissonance, a contrast between what you heard and what you felt. It was like naming an earthquake Tinkerbell or a tsunami Fluffy. The name disarmed you, but the reality pulled you under. And this tension, that it sounded silly but meant something potentially terrifying, became the very engine of its legend. It allowed people to approach the mystery without fear, only to find that it quietly unnerved them the longer they looked at it. Even today, mention the bloop to someone who's heard of it, and you'll get a raised eyebrow, maybe a half smile. But underneath that smile is the memory of hearing something they can't quite explain. A noise with no clear source, no satisfying explanation. A laugh that ends in a shiver. The name also did something even more important. It gave the public permission to engage. Scientific anomalies often vanish into the void of academic publishing, too dense and dry for the average person to grasp. But the bloop, with its kindergarten-friendly name, became approachable. It became shareable. It became ours. Everyone could understand what a bloop might sound like. Everyone could listen to the clip and say, "That's strange." No technical background needed. It democratized curiosity, and in doing so, it became one of the most widely known unexplained sounds in human history. Its name let it leave the lab, and once it did, there was no putting it back. There's also something subtly important about how naming it humanized it. Not human in the sense of anthropomorphizing the source, but in the sense of showing that even the world's most rigorous scientists, even the people working with military-grade underwater surveillance tools, are still people. People who sometimes laugh, who name things on instinct, who feel a thrill when they find something strange. The bloop wasn't just a name, it was an admission of wonder, a quiet nod to the unknown, a recognition that every so often the sea still manages to surprise even its most faithful listeners. And so, the name became legend. It passed from technician to journalist to YouTuber to urban legend enthusiast to author to cryptid hunter to late-night podcast listener. It mutated and multiplied. Some called it a sea monster. Others claimed it was a classified experiment. Some linked it to Cthulhu. Others to Atlantis, others still to the secret language of the planet itself. But underneath every theory, every story was that same ridiculous little name, the bloop. 3 syllables, soft, round, oddly comforting. A name that made you smile before it made you wonder. A name that stuck. And in that stickiness, in that perfect, accidental branding, it ensured that this one strange sound from the bottom of the world would never be forgotten. For most phenomena in the natural world, repetition is the rule, not the exception. Waves crash in predictable rhythms. The tides rise and fall like breath. Earthquakes along fault lines might vary in magnitude, but the motion is inevitable. Even chaos has a pattern if you know where to look. So when the bloop was first discovered and logged in the summer of 1997, one of the first questions any acoustic scientist would have asked, one of the first questions any rational mind would form in the face of something strange, is, does it repeat? Was this a one-time event, a freak occurrence, a random shudder in the Earth's vast aquatic belly? Or was it part of something ongoing, something recurring, something with rhythm and intent? The early NOAA recordings hinted at something quietly thrilling. The bloop wasn't recorded just once. Not precisely. Multiple iterations, slightly varied but fundamentally similar, were picked up over a span of several months, all within the same general acoustic shape, the same low-frequency range, the same signature rising frequency curve that would later become infamous. These weren't copy-paste events, they weren't echoes, they were new emissions, fresh anomalies, repeating across the hydrophone network at irregular intervals from spring through early fall. This sent a thrill through the acoustic monitoring community, because in repetition there is hope. Hope for pattern, for correlation, for understanding. If something repeats, you can model it. If you can model it, you can predict it. If you can predict it, you can test theories against it, rule out possibilities, narrow the field. In short, repetition gives the unknown a shape. And for a brief shimmering moment in 1997, the bloop seemed like it might give us that shape. Analysts began paying closer attention to the South Pacific sensors. Software was set to auto-flag any signatures that even remotely resembled the now famous upward sweeping curve. There were rumours too, though never formally published, of lower-grade bloop-like events going back to earlier years, odd signals buried in the 1995 and 1996 data logs that only stood out in retrospect once people knew what to look for. Some scientists speculated that whatever had caused the bloop may have passed through this region before, or had been active at a lower volume beneath the detection threshold. There was a real hope, unspoken but palpable, that this might be a recurring event like whale migration or iceberg calving, a seasonal phenomenon only just now getting noticed. But then the recordings stopped, and with them, the hope of pattern faded. No more bloop signals were picked up in 1998, none in 1999, none in the decades that followed. The Pacific went back to its usual chorus of seismic rumbles, whale moans, hydrothermal sighs, and the occasional ice quake from Antarctica. But no more bloop. Whatever had made the sound, or whatever process had triggered it, did not announce itself again. It came once, maybe a few times, clustered together in a single year, and then vanished like a whisper that had only meant to be heard in passing. And the silence that followed was deafening. Because that's the thing about repetition. You don't notice how much you depend on it until it disappears. The absence of a second season of bloop events turned the mystery into a monument. Had it repeated reliably, it would have entered the ecosystem of known phenomena. It could have been studied, dissected, explained, or at least normalized. But in refusing to repeat, it became something else entirely, a glimpse, a moment, a single frame from a film we'll never see again. This made it all the more tantalizing. What kind of thing speaks once, then never again? What kind of mechanism, biological, geological or otherwise, operates with that kind of silence, that kind of reticence? Some theorize that it was a singular event, an icequake of unusual acoustic character, never to be replicated. Others wondered if it was the death cry of something enormous and unseen, some colossal beast breaking apart beneath the pressure, singing a final note before disintegrating into the cold dark. More poetic minds imagined a migrating giant, surfacing briefly from the deep, sounding off across the world, and then diving down again into regions beyond the reach of our senses. Some even entertained the unlikeliest ideas that it had never been from Earth at all, that it was a test, a ping, a sonar signal from something else entirely, passing by only once, uninterested in our reply. But for all the speculation, the fact remained: the bloop never came back, or if it did, we never heard it. And in this failure to repeat, it became something paradoxical, a legend born not of presence, but of absence. It is deeply human to search for. Patterns, our brains are wired for it. We look at stars and see constellations, we hear footsteps in static, faces in the grain of wood. We crave predictability, and when a phenomenon like the bloop teases us with the possibility of regularity, then withdraws, it leaves us worse off than before. Not only do we not understand it, but we almost did. It's like losing a name on the tip of your tongue, or forgetting a dream seconds after waking up. You remember just enough to know that you've lost something, and this is the true power of the bloop's vanishing act. It hurts not because we didn't catch it, but because we came so close. The hydrophones were working, the data was clean, the sound was triangulated, and then nothing. Years passed. New anomalies were recorded. Upsweep, Julia, whistle, train. But none had the same combination of factors: the biological profile, the reach, the volume, the origin point. Some sounded stranger, some were louder, some repeated. But none captured the public's imagination the way the bloop had, because none carried with them that sting of unfulfilled promise. NOAA never officially declared the bloop resolved during this period. There were hypotheses, of course. Ice-related origin theories began to take form in the early 2000s, but no official ruling declared it solved. That wouldn't come until later. During these years of silence, the mystery had room to grow roots, and in that silence, the bloop became something more than data. It became folklore, a strange digital myth whispered between forums, passed around in late-night Reddit threads and pseudo-scientific documentaries on niche cable channels. A thing that called once from the deep and then was gone, and the ocean, maddening as always, gave us no closure. It never said, "You misunderstood." It never gave us a follow-up act. The hydrophones remain, still listening, still capturing the endless murmuring of the Earth's watery lungs. But the bloop, whatever it was, has never cleared its throat again. And so we sit here, with our graphs and our guesses, haunted not by the mystery itself, but by its refusal to repeat. It didn't echo, it didn't linger, it just happened. And if that isn't enough to keep you awake a little longer tonight, listening to the hum in your walls or the soft creak of pipes in your house, then you may be braver than most. Because the idea that something could cry out across the entire ocean once, and never again, is somehow more chilling than any monster story. It speaks to the random, indifferent nature of the universe. It suggests that the truly strange things may not follow rules at all, that they may simply pass through, leaving no footprints, only a sound. One time, one moment, A bloop in the dark. Of all the millions of sounds recorded beneath the ocean's surface, of the thousands of logs, blips, booms, and crackles stored on NOAA servers like messages in bottles from the depths, none ever quite sounded like the bloop. It wasn't just the volume or the shape or the strange way it refused to repeat that made it exceptional. It was the way it defied categorization even as it flirted with familiarity. Every noise we catalogue in the ocean fits eventually into a family. Volcanic eruptions have a low, blunt register, short in duration, often accompanied by broadband reverberations and sometimes a thermal trail picked up by satellite. Ice quakes, massive pieces of shelf or berg shifting under pressure, tend to have a stuttering rhythm, sharp attacks followed by long decays, sometimes repetitive, often seasonal. Earthquakes are distinct, jagged, sharp, and chaotic, full of overlapping frequency spikes like the sound of a planet grinding its molars. Whale calls, meanwhile, are graceful, almost melodic in their patterns. Even the eerie songs of the 52 Hz whale, the so-called loneliest whale in the world, have a structure, a rhythm, a repeatability that distinguishes them from geological noise. But the bloop fit nowhere. It didn't rumble like a quake. It didn't chatter like an iceberg. It didn't echo like a whale. It was slow, broad, with a strange rising tone that swept upward in frequency. A sonic shape that, when visualized on a spectrogram, looked like a perfect biological curve. And yet the amplitude, the strength of the signal was too powerful, far too powerful for any known animal to generate. And so, the bloop became something unique, the only underwater sound ever recorded that looked like a life form and sounded like a landmass tearing itself apart. That contradiction is where its real power lies, because if it had sounded purely biological, we would have hunted for a creature. If it had sounded purely geological, we would have filed it with the rest. But it didn't. It stood balanced, unnervingly between the two, hinting at both, but confirming neither. Analysts would later admit that this liminality, the refusal of the sound to declare allegiance to any known source, was what made it so difficult to classify. One moment it would seem like some vast cetacean calling across the ages. The next, it would echo like an entire shelf of ice shearing free of its ancient moorings. But when overlaid with known sound profiles, it failed every test. Blue whales, for instance, are the loudest animals on Earth. Their calls can reach 188 decibels and travel hundreds of kilometers in the SOFAR channel. And yet even they are dwarfed by the reach of the bloop, which was recorded by hydrophones over 5,000 kilometers apart. To produce a sound like that biologically would require lungs the size of buildings, muscles dense enough to compress entire cubic meters of water, and a biology that defies everything we understand about marine life. Some suggested perhaps it wasn't lungs at all, but some other mechanism, resonant bladders, pressurized cavities, unknown echo chambers inside a leviathan yet unseen. But even those speculative guesses felt like fantasy. There is no known biomechanical system capable of generating such a clean, powerful, far-reaching signature. And if it was not biological, then it must have been something else. A collapse, perhaps. A sudden undersea landslide. But these leave noise, debris, aftershocks, acoustic fingerprints that the bloop did not possess. And so it sat. Outside every folder, a data orphan, a waveform without a home. NOAA's analysts began compiling it into presentation decks, quietly showing it at conferences, introducing it with a laugh to break the tension. We call this one the bloop. It always got a smile until the audio played, until the slide changed to show just how far the signal travelled, until the graph of decibel strength overlaid with distance appeared, and then the room would go quiet. Because anyone who's spent time listening to the deep knows how unusual that is. The ocean is full of weird noises, strange warbles, sonar anomalies, the occasional whoop or ping whose source eludes documentation, but they are small, local, contained. The bloop, by contrast, was a mega sound, a sonic event. It did not just ripple through the ocean, it resonated with it, as though the water itself had become a tuning fork, and that has led some to a more unsettling theory. Not just that the bloop was something in the ocean, but something that interacted with the ocean. That the sound might not have been the voice of a thing, but the byproduct of some larger interaction. Tectonic, thermal, gravitational, dimensional, who knows, that used the ocean as a medium to express itself. That's the thing about sound. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. It requires a medium. And when the medium is the ocean, with its pressure and depth and thermal gradients and unknown topography, strange things can happen. Sound can bend, fold, refract, combine, distort, amplify, and in rare cases like this one, create something entirely unique, something singular. That is why, to this day, the bloop is often considered a category unto itself. Not just a sound, but the sound, a benchmark, a question mark rendered in vibration. If you go to NOAA's Public Acoustic Archive now, you'll find a handful of famous anomalies. Upsweep, with its repeated seasonal pulses. Train, a long drawn-out rumble that fades like a dying engine. Whistle, a high-pitched and fast-decaying chirp that no one's been able to duplicate. But the bloop is the crown jewel. Not because it's the weirdest, not even because it's the loudest, but because it is, acoustically speaking, alone. No other recording matches its full suite of characteristics, its amplitude, its distance, its shape, its frequency, its triangulated location, its non-repeating nature. It is, to borrow from cryptography, an unbroken cipher. We have the key, we have the lock, but the two refuse to match. And that leaves scientists with a kind of respectful frustration. They want to believe it was ice, or seismic, or just an animal, a very big, very rare animal. But none of the known explanations fits comfortably. They are clothes that almost fit but tear at the seams when stretched too far. And so we are left with what is perhaps the most unsettling scientific category of all: unique. In a world where everything is supposed to have precedent, where knowledge builds upon knowledge in tidy steps, the bloop offers no such comfort. It stands alone, a sound unlike any other, heard once, understood never. A song sung by something the ocean has since swallowed, and whether it was the voice of an animal, the moan of a shifting ice shelf, the groan of Earth's crust, or something more bizarre and profound than any of those, something reaching out just once to let us know that we are not the only things making noise in the dark, that question still lingers, still echoes, still bloops, quietly in the corners of our imagination. There is a particular moment in the life cycle of any scientific anomaly when it ceases to be the sole property of specialists, of analysts, of the quiet minds who study the world through data and models and frequency curves, and begins instead to belong to everyone. This moment is rarely orchestrated, it is rarely planned. It often arrives unexpectedly, a result of timing and language and just the right amount of cultural readiness. In the case of the bloop, This transition from arcane anomaly to pop cultural enigma can be traced not to a government report or a declassified study or a dramatic press conference, but rather to a single article written by a curious and sharply observant science journalist named David Wolman. Published in the July 2002 issue of Wired magazine, the piece was titled simply "Tracking the Bloop," and in just a few pages it accomplished something that NOAA, with all its funding and monitoring arrays and decades of data collection, had never managed to do. It made the bloop famous. But to understand why this happened, why this particular piece in this particular magazine was able to carry a strange underwater sound from the depths of obscurity into the collective consciousness, you have to understand the cultural moment in which it landed. The early 2000s were a strange and shifting time. The internet was growing, mutating, spreading beyond universities and tech labs into the homes and routines of ordinary people. Broadband was beginning to replace dial-up. Forums and blogs were multiplying like bacteria. A generation that had grown up watching X-Files reruns and reading Unsolved Mysteries paperbacks was now able to connect, organize, and, most importantly, share. People weren't just passively consuming mystery anymore, they were curating it, and Wired, then as now, sat right on the boundary between the technical and the cultural. It was a publication that spoke fluently to the engineers and programmers and scientists, but also to the dreamers and creatives and insomniacs who wanted to understand the bleeding edge of weirdness. David Wolman, already known for his clear-eyed takes on science and technology, approached the bloop not as a cryptid chaser or a hype man, but as a thoughtful outsider with a simple, genuine question: what was that sound? And in framing the question so directly, so conversationally, so accessibly, he created a narrative bridge between the obscure world of deep ocean acoustics and the bright, fast-paced public imagination that was just beginning to bloom online. In the article, Wolman introduced readers to the technical underpinnings of NOAA's monitoring program, explaining the SOFAR channel, the Cold War origins of the hydrophones, the peculiarities of low-frequency sound propagation, with clarity and a touch of humour. But more importantly, he let the mystery breathe. He didn't rush to debunk or over-speculate. He let the facts speak. A loud, upward-sweeping sound, heard thousands of kilometres apart, origin unknown, structure oddly biological. And he let that not knowing sit there, vibrating in the reader's chest like the echo of the sound itself. The bloop, he suggested, wasn't just an acoustic anomaly. It was a cultural event waiting to happen. And he was right. The piece spread like wildfire. Not instantly, like a tweet today, but in that slow, sticky way things did in the early 2000s, shared via forwarded emails, printed out and pinned to bulletin boards, referenced in chat rooms and early internet forums. Sites like Something Awful, Forshun's paranormal boards, and later Reddit's Aria Unresolved. Mysteries began to pick it up. The bloop became a meme, but one with teeth, a piece of content that was funny and bizarre and unsettling in equal measure. Because Wolman hadn't just written about a sound. He had reintroduced the public to the idea that Earth itself still had secrets. Big ones, wet ones, ones that didn't glow or fly or leave crop circles, but that swam silently in a place most people forgot existed. And the timing could not have been better. The years following 2001 were full of fear, instability, and cultural exhaustion. People were disillusioned with governments, wary of media, and increasingly skeptical of easy answers. Into that climate, the Bloop arrived like an elegant kind of unknown. Not threatening, not conspiratorial, just strange. Just strange enough to be plausible. Just plausible enough to be unsettling. Just unsettling enough to spark obsession. The internet began generating its own mythology. Amateur sound engineers dissected the audio. Cryptid theorists cross-referenced Lovecraft stories and pointed out that the coordinates of the Bloop's origin sat eerily close to the supposed location of R'lyeh, the fictional sunken city of Cthulhu. Artists painted depictions of unseen leviathans surfacing beneath ships. Early YouTube videos layered the Bloop audio with imagery of vast underwater silhouettes, teeth the size of surfboards, glowing eyes in the black. And through it all, David Wolman's article remained the touchstone. Even now, years later, people trying to understand the origins of the Bloop invariably end up at that 2002 Wired piece. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't speculative, but it was trustworthy. It laid out what we knew and, more importantly, what we didn't. And by naming the mystery without claiming to solve it, it allowed readers to step inside it. Woolman, knowingly or not, created a new genre with that article, the scientifically responsible modern myth. A story rooted in data but told with wonder, a narrative that doesn't end with "we figured it out," but with "what do you think it was?" That question, posed in the minds of readers all over the world, was what gave the Bloop its legs. It turned from a strange no-way recording into a global campfire story, one you could tell in a dorm room, or over drinks, or in the quiet dark before bed. The sound became something to share, not for its danger, but for its mystery. It was not a roar, it was not a threat, it was a bloop, and yet, it lingered. And that lingering was only possible because someone took the time to tell its story properly. Because someone treated it not like a joke or a hoax or a headline, but like a piece of music. Something heard once, deeply, and never quite forgotten. In the years since, David Wolman has written on many topics: science, politics, language. But to this day, he remains forever tied to the Bloop. In some ways, he gave it its voice, not the sound itself, that came from the deep, but the echo, the resonance, the context that let it travel not just across the ocean, but across the imagination of an entire planet. And now, whenever someone hears that soft, peculiar audio clip, whenever someone types Bloop sound into YouTube and presses play on a grainy recording with pulsing bass and strange captions, they're not just hearing the noise, they're hearing the echo of that article, the echo of that cultural moment, the echo of a time when the ocean reminded us just briefly that we don't know everything, that we aren't finished discovering, that the world still has room for one more mystery. And all of that because a journalist decided to ask a very simple question. What is that sound? And why haven't we heard it again? The early 2000s were a strange and liminal time, perched precariously between analog and digital, between skepticism and belief, between lonely nighttime speculation and the first great wave of shared digital wonder. It was a time when the internet was still strange, still wild, still lit by the flickering neon of message boards and dial-up tones, where information moved slowly enough to feel personal and fast enough to feel uncontainable. And it was in this space, this fertile, chaotic, irreverent, half-serious, half-sincere space, that the Bloop took on new life, not as a line item in a NoAA archive, not as a line in a magazine article, but as a cryptid, a creature, a presence, a character in the ever-expanding mythos of the deep. But before diving into the Bloop's second life as an internet cryptid, it's worth understanding what that term even meant back then. Cryptid, in the early web's lexicon, wasn't just a word for Bigfoot or Nessie. It was a shorthand for possibility, a placeholder for anything too weird to dismiss and too compelling to prove. Cryptids were the internet's way of saying, "I want to believe," without necessarily having to say it out loud, and the early 2000s were obsessed with them. Shows like Monster Quest, Unsolved Mysteries, and Destination Truth were airing on cable, mixing dramatization with shaky eyewitness accounts and moody reenactments. The idea of the unexplained, especially creatures in water, in woods, in skies, fit perfectly into the millennial anxiety of the time. The sense that we were inheriting a world so thoroughly mapped and catalogued that the only places left for mystery were the margins, the dark, the deep, and nothing is more marginal, more abyssal, more untouched than the bottom of the ocean. It's no coincidence that the internet of this era fell in love with the sea, not the romantic sea of beach vacations or Jacques Cousteau documentaries, but the dark sea, the other sea, the sea as frontier, the sea as void, the sea as mirror to space. This cultural undercurrent, pun reluctantly intended, gave the Bloop an almost mythic pedestal from which to launch. Unlike Bigfoot or the Jersey Devil, the Bloop had something the others lacked: data, a sound, a recording, a thing you could play, something real, captured by real scientists, discussed in real publications, but also, crucially, something with no agreed-upon explanation. It had credibility and ambiguity, the holy grail of internet mystery, and the digital world ran with it. Forums like ATS Above Top Secret, Coast to Coast's web supplements, early subreddits, and the comment sections of cryptozoology blogs lit up with speculation. Was it a kaiju? A prehistoric relic? A deep-sea anomaly generated by something massive brushing against the ocean floor? Was it a military experiment gone wrong or right? A classified undersea base broadcasting test to its silent drones? Or, stretching into stranger waters, was it a creature so large, so ancient, that it only vocalized once in a millennium, a leviathan whose pulse aligned with the rhythms of tectonic drift and planetary tilt? The Bloop became a Rorschach test for digital mystery lovers. It didn't come with baggage or a grainy photo or a hoax attached. It was clean, pure, a sound, a bloop. And into that void everyone poured their theories. The name helped, of course. The Bloop was irresistible to meme culture. Its childish simplicity contrasted perfectly with the horror of its implications. You could joke about it. Sounds like my stomach after Taco Bell. And then, in the next breath, spiral into existential terror about unknowable things moving beneath miles of black water. People photoshopped Bloop beasts into satellite images, theorized about deep-sea civilizations, posted theories that tied the sound to Lovecraftian lore, and slowly, steadily, the Bloop was absorbed into the internet's collective folklore. It became a kind of shorthand, not just for this one sound, but for the idea that there were still things out there that science couldn't explain. That maybe despite all our satellites and sensors and submarines, the Earth still had secrets, and the timing again could not have been more perfect. The post-9/11 world was full of disillusionment and institutional mistrust. People had begun to suspect that the powers that be knew more than they were letting on. The rise of online communities provided a space for these suspicions to grow into collaborative myth-making. If Noah had a sound they couldn't explain, then maybe, just maybe, they were covering up something deeper, and even if they weren't, the community would build the myth for them. A 2007 YouTube video titled "The Bloop, What Was It?" racked up millions of views, pairing the eerie audio clip with deep, ambient music and slowly zooming images of the ocean floor. Another channel layered the bloop sound with a visual of a cargo ship dwarfed by a shadow beneath the surface. Fans of games like Echo the Dolphin, BioShock and Subnautica began sharing bloop lore as though it were canon, creating fictional logs and in-game encounters. The bloop seeped into every corner of digital mystery culture. It wasn't long before it became a staple of top 10 unexplained ocean sounds, videos and creepiest unsolved phenomena listicles. And in all of these, one thing remained consistent. Nobody knew what it was. Even as theories were proposed, some more grounded like ice quakes and others fantastical, the essential mystery remained intact. Because that's what gave it its power. It didn't need to be solved. In fact, solving it might have ruined it. In this way, the bloop became a symbol of digital age folklore, a story without a centre, owned by everyone, shaped by community, not author. It was open source mythology. And what's fascinating about internet cryptids, unlike their real-world predecessors, is that they evolve. They respond to memes, to new findings, to cultural moods. For example, during the 2010s resurgence of Lovecraftian horror in indie games and fiction, the bloop was routinely reinterpreted as the call of some dormant elder being, an ancient god stirring in the Mariana Trench. People wrote short stories in which the bloop was the first sign of awakening. Others layered it into ARGs, alternate reality games, weaving the sound into sprawling narratives about deep-sea installations, failed experiments, and flooded research stations. And perhaps most haunting of all was the way the sound itself, so simple, so low in fidelity, kept finding new listeners. Every year someone would hear it for the first time. Someone would type weird ocean sound into Google and stumble across it. Someone would feel that jolt, that brief, electric moment of what the hell is that, and fall down the rabbit hole anew. The bloop, more than anything else, was viral in the old sense of the word. Not a flash in the pan, not an algorithm-fed loop of attention, but something contagious, passed hand to hand, whisper to whisper, across forums and videos and minds. It was a sound that became a story that became a symbol. And long after Noah released their official hypothesis, and long after science journalists moved on to other mysteries, the bloop remained, in Minecraft mods, in scary TikToks, in podcast lore, in 1,000 short stories written by teenagers who didn't care about icebergs, but felt a chill when they heard the audio. It lives there still, deep in the bones of the internet, deep in the minds of those who want to believe, or at least want to imagine. A ghost noise, a sea monster, a glitch in the planet, a question with no answer, the perfect digital cryptid, and all of it, built from nothing more than a sound, a name, and a silence that followed. It would be comforting in a way if the bloop were an isolated incident, a one-time anomaly that, by virtue of its uniqueness, could be put into a box and labelled accordingly. Unexplained, yes, but exceptional. Singular. But it wasn't. Not really. Because while the bloop remains the most famous, the most viral, the most narratively potent of all the deep sea's acoustic oddities, it is not alone, not even close. Over the decades that NOAA and its affiliated institutions have listened to the low-frequency symphony of the ocean, they've recorded a number of strange sounds, each with its own signature, its own geographic fingerprint, its own unsettling refusal to fit neatly into known categories. And while none may carry the mythic weight of the bloop, together they suggest something even more profound, that the sea is full of sounds we don't understand, that the bloop may not have been an isolated cry from the abyss, but part of a chorus we've only just begun to hear. Consider, for instance, the sound known as upsweep. First recorded in 1991 and detected seasonally ever since, upsweep is a series of long, narrow-band upsweeping sounds, each rising steadily in pitch like a slow electronic yawn. The source has been located somewhere in the south-central Pacific, close, but not identical to the region where the bloop was triangulated. What makes upsweep particularly strange is its seasonal nature. It peaks in spring and autumn, only to quiet down during other parts of the year. No known biological or geological process accounts for this regularity. The sound has diminished over time, but it has never disappeared. It comes and goes like a tide, as though something deep beneath the waves is breathing. Then there's Slow Down, recorded on May 19th, 1997, just months before the bloop. This sound, like its more famous cousin, began at a higher pitch and gradually decreased over several minutes, suggesting a large-scale movement of matter through water. NOAA eventually attributed it, perhaps too neatly, to the friction of a large iceberg running aground. But again, the profile was odd, the source uncertain. The sound was captured thousands of kilometers away by multiple hydrophones, its origin traced to the Antarctic Peninsula. It came once and never returned, like a scrape in the dark, a claw against stone. Julia, another famous anomaly, was recorded on March 1st, 1999, and bore one of the most human-like acoustic signatures ever captured by NOAA's instruments. It was a long, drawn-out moan, deep and wavering, lasting for nearly 2 minutes. The sound was so oddly shaped, so organic in tone, that it immediately triggered comparisons to the bloop. In fact, the two are often cited together in speculative media, their waveforms displayed side by side like fingerprints of twin ghosts. Julia's source was estimated to be in the eastern equatorial Pacific. NOAA suggested it was an iceberg echoing across the sound channel, but no iceberg large enough to match it was ever identified. It came, it moaned, it vanished. Then there is Whistle, a brief but high-pitched sound recorded in 1997 in the Mariana Trench region. Unlike the bloop or Slow Down, Whistle was short and sharp, peaking rapidly in a frequency range inconsistent with known seismic or glacial activity. It stood out because it didn't match anything, and because of where it happened. The Mariana Trench is the deepest part of the world's oceans. It is a place of silence, pressure, and unimaginable cold. Nothing about it is normal. Nothing about it is kind. And something there made a sound that didn't belong. Then comes Train, a noise that earned its name because it resembled the distant rhythmic rumble of a passing locomotive, captured by an array of hydrophones in 1997, the same year again it was traced to the equatorial Pacific. NOAA again suggested ice movement as the likely cause, but skeptics noted that the consistent rhythm of the sound was atypical of iceberg events and more suggestive of artificial or even mechanical origins. What kind of mechanism No one could say. But the idea that something massive and rhythmic was operating in the ocean, deep below the surface, triggered a wave of conjecture. Secret bases, submerged installations, machines older than civilization itself. All fantasy, perhaps, but fantasy with an audio track. There are others too, less famous but no less strange. Boomer, Bloop 2, and 100 unnamed anomalies catalogued in NOAA's internal databases and barely mentioned in academic papers. Each one adds a tile to the mosaic of unknown sounds in the ocean, each one a clue or a distraction. Some are likely ice quakes, some might be whales, some might be sonar glitches or atmospheric reflections, but some, just enough to keep you up at night, resist explanation. What links them, more than their frequency or location, is the feeling they create, that prickling awareness that we are being spoken to, not in language, but in vibration, that something enormous and unknowable is stirring just beneath the veil, that we are not alone in the dark water. What makes this body of sound so compelling is how they relate to each other. The bloop, for all its fame, may simply be the loudest and most charismatic member of a family of acoustic ghosts, each one different, but all of them echoing from the same haunted cathedral. A place where ice shifts, plates groan, animals call, and occasionally, very occasionally, something else makes a noise, something unclassified, something old. And we are reminded in these sounds that the ocean is not just a biome, it is a chamber, a great echoing mouth that occasionally opens, not to speak in words, but to remind us that we have not yet learned how to listen. Because when you strip away the theories, when you lay the spectrograms side by side and scroll through NOAA's archives, what you see is not just data. You see a map of human limitation. You see the outline of everything we don't understand. The ocean's songbook is still largely unread. Its syllables are pressure and mass and time. Its instruments are shelf ice, basalt, and creatures whose eyes have never known light. And when it sings, we record the sound and give it a name: Julia, whistle, slow down, bloop. But we do not comprehend the melody. Not yet, not fully, maybe not ever. But the sounds are still coming. They are recorded daily. New anomalies appear. Some are explained, most are not. And in the silence that follows, in the long years between one bloop and the next, we are left with this: a planet that still whispers, still sings, still has secrets, and somewhere, out there, another hydrophone clicks on and waits. For all the myth and media and speculative fiction that the bloop has inspired, its ascent into cryptid royalty, its transformation into a household enigma discussed on podcasts and plastered across thumbnails and narrated over grainy ocean floor imagery, there's one group of people for whom it has never been a source of entertainment or even fascination, so much as a source of quiet, enduring frustration: the scientists. Not because they don't love a good mystery, not because they aren't curious, but because they are responsible for the truth, even when it's messy, incomplete, or unromantic, especially when it's unromantic. These are men and women who have dedicated their lives to listening to the planet, not to confirm the legends we want, but to understand the systems we need to survive. They sit in small offices, buried in research labs or tucked into government facilities, surrounded by walls of acoustic charts and frequency maps and recordings that most people would call noise. They know what whale song looks like on a spectrogram. They can identify the sound of an ice shelf disintegrating from hundreds of miles away. They are fluent in the murmurs of the deep, and when something comes along that defies classification, something that mimics biology but moves like geology, that sounds like a cry but behaves like a collapse, they are not thrilled, they are cautious. Because mystery is not, to a scientist, a playground, it's a liability. The scientific community that studied the bloop, particularly those in NOAA's Pacific Marine Environmental Lab, approached the sound with the same tools they'd used to study an underwater volcano or a rogue iceberg. They analysed it by its duration, its frequency spectrum, its harmonics, its propagation. They plotted its source, matched its profile, compared it to decades of known events. They treated it like data, not folklore. And yet, no matter how precisely they parsed it, the bloop stubbornly refused to settle, and that unsettled them. Not because they feared it was something monstrous, but because it refused to be repeatable. And in science, repeatability is the backbone of knowledge. If a thing cannot be repeated, it cannot be reliably studied. If it cannot be studied, it cannot be explained. If it cannot be explained, it cannot be integrated into the body of what we know. It remains a rogue datum, an anomaly, a footnote. And scientists, especially the ones who work in federally funded institutions, don't get paid to chase footnotes. What frustrated them most was not the sound itself, it was everything that came after. The media frenzy, the viral posts, the cryptid videos, the wild speculations. They watched as something they couldn't fully explain was picked up, dressed in sea monster costumes, wrapped in clickbait headlines, and marched across the internet like a parade balloon. They were quoted out of context, their cautious language distorted, their uncertainty treated as endorsement. They were asked to comment on Lovecraft, on Godzilla, on undiscovered megafauna. They were accused of covering things up or of lacking imagination. They were mocked for suggesting that the most likely explanation was ice. But what choice did they have? The icequake theory made sense. It matched the waveform. It fit the data. It had precedence. And most importantly, it required the fewest assumptions. Occam's razor isn't romantic, but it's sharp for a reason. And yet, even within the scientific community, there was a quiet gnawing at the edge of the conversation. Because many of them, though they would never admit it in a publication, wanted the bloop to be something more. Not because they believed in monsters, but because scientists, underneath the caution and the training, are explorers. They dream of discovery, of finding the unknown and making it known. The bloop represented a kind of unfulfilled promise. It felt like a new category waiting to be born, but it never repeated. It never expanded. It never gave them the second data point they needed to justify deeper inquiry. And in the vacuum left by that silence, public speculation filled every inch of space. Scientists who had spent their careers trying to communicate the complexity of ocean acoustics found themselves reduced to sound bites. Their models were ignored, their careful peer-reviewed reports drowned out by dramatic YouTube narrators declaring, "We have no idea what made this sound." That wasn't true. They had ideas, good ones, thoughtful ones. But science doesn't scream, it whispers. And in the modern age, whispers don't trend. What also frustrated them, more than the myths, more than the memes, was the implication that not knowing something made them bad at their jobs. Because uncertainty in science is not a failure. It is the space in which discovery lives. Saying we don't know is an act of honesty, not defeat. But to the public, conditioned to expect answers and conclusions and Hollywood arcs, we don't know often reads as weakness. And so the very integrity that led these researchers to publish their uncertainty was used against them. And yet, through all this, they kept listening. That's what they do. They listen. Every day, hydrophones scattered across the oceans collect terabytes of audio. Most of it is noise, wind, rain, tectonic shift, whale migration. But buried within that signal are always anomalies, small and large, waiting to be understood. Scientists log them, compare them, try to build new models. The work is slow, meticulous, unseen, and once in a while, something like the bloop slips through, and they brace. Not for the sound, but for the attention. Because attention, in science, is a double-edged sword. It can bring funding, but it can also bring distortion. They didn't ask for the bloop to go viral. They didn't name it that. They didn't call it Cthulhu's Call or a prelude to an awakening. They called it what it was. An unidentified low-frequency sound, possibly of cryoseismic origin. That was the truth. And in their world, the truth is sacred, even when it's incomplete, especially when it's incomplete. There is perhaps a kind of nobility in their frustration, because in resisting the urge to mythologize, they protected the mystery. They left the door opened, not wide, but ajar, for others to come in, to listen, to learn. They didn't kill the story, they grounded it. And maybe that's what makes the bloop so enduring. It exists in that tension, that unsteady balance between the scientists who want to explain it and the rest of us who want it to remain unexplained. Between the rigour of what is known and the wonder of what is possible. Between the charts and the stars. Between the cry of the ice and the silence that followed. And in the quiet halls of Noah, there are still scientists, older now, maybe retired, maybe training younger ears, who remember the day that sound first came through, who remember plotting the waveform, who remember the shape, the volume, the first whispered half-joking name, the bloop, and maybe, just maybe, they still wonder what it really was, even as they write the papers, even as they draw the graphs. Maybe, behind the glass of reason, they still listen, just in case it comes back. For all our collective talk about how little we know of the cosmos, how vast and unknowable space remains, how the light from distant stars takes billions of years to reach us, how we've barely scraped the surface of nearby planets with rovers and remote probes, it's easy to forget that we live atop an ocean that is, in many ways, more alien, more bizarre, and more inaccessible than the planets we send spacecraft to. The deep sea is not just a place on Earth. It is a place beneath Earth, a layered, pressure-crushed, pitch-black world that begins where sunlight dies, around 200 meters deep, and extends downward into trench systems and abyssal plains, so unvisited, so poorly mapped, that we know more about the surface of Mars than we do about them. It is not an exaggeration. NASA has mapped 100% of Mars's surface at high resolution. In contrast, only about 25% of Earth's seafloor has been mapped in any comparable detail. The rest is a dark mystery. Ridges taller than mountain ranges, plains larger than continents, valleys that make the Grand Canyon look like a scratch in the soil. And within these spaces, beyond light, beyond warmth, beyond what most people would even recognize as Earth, life not only exists but thrives. Strange, impossible life. Creatures that would not look out of place in a science fiction movie. organisms whose biology makes a mockery of surface norms, fish with transparent heads, jellyfish that pulse with colours no painter could ever truly capture, worms that feast on bones, and bacteria that metabolize hydrogen sulfide from hydrothermal vents as though it were fresh air. There is a fish called the barrelly, which has a skull like a bubble. Its head is completely transparent, its eyes cylindrical and green, rotated inward to stare upward through its own skull like a periscope looking for prey silhouetted by the dim twilight above. There is the gulper eel, whose mouth is so large and loose-jawed that it can consume prey half its size by unhinging its head like a snake that lives in nightmares. There is the comb jelly, which is not a jellyfish, and has no brain, no heart, no blood, but swims by beating rows of cilia that scatter light into glittering rainbows. There are isopods the size of footballs, living on the ocean floor like armoured aliens. There are sea spiders whose legs can span 2 feet, their hearts located in their legs, their blood systems as strange as their silent, creeping movements across the sediment. There are hydrothermal vent communities, deep in the darkness near mid-ocean ridges, where entire ecosystems bloom around scalding towers of mineral-rich water heated by magma. Here, in temperatures that alternate between boiling and freezing in a matter of centimetres, life not only endures but depends on these extremes. Giant tube worms, eyeless shrimp, sulphur-eating archaea. These are not outliers. These are the norms of the deep, and we barely understand any of it. The deep sea is not just biologically strange, it is chemically, physically, existentially strange. Down here, pressure increases by 1 atmosphere every 10 metres. At 1,000 metres, just a fraction of the way to the ocean's deepest zones, pressure is already 100 times what we experience at sea level. At the bottom of the Mariana Trench, pressure exceeds 1,000 atmospheres. That's over 16,000 pounds per square inch. It is enough to crush steel like a soda can. And yet, down there, in the Hadal zone, life continues. Not just microbes, but amphipods and sea cucumbers and other bottom-dwelling scavengers. They do not simply tolerate the pressure, they require it. Remove them from that environment and they die. Their membranes collapse, their cellular chemistry fails. They are tuned to a world that would destroy us instantly. What's more, their movement, their feeding, their excretions, everything they do produces sound. Not all of it is audible to us, or even recordable by our current equipment. But the deep sea is not a place of silence. It is a place of muffled collisions, low-frequency moans, organic pulses, and the occasional reverberation of geological violence. The sea talks to itself, constantly. And in that constant churning conversation, there are voices we do not yet recognize. What makes all of this so relevant to the mystery of the bloop is not that any one creature is likely to be responsible, but that the very existence of such bizarre alien life reminds us how little we truly know. When NOAA scientists say they haven't identified a sound, they're not implying it's supernatural. They're acknowledging the statistical certainty that our ocean is still largely unmapped, unexplored, and full of biological phenomena that could astonish us if only we had the tools to see or hear them clearly. Consider that every year, without fail, scientists discover new marine species, not 1 or 2, hundreds, some microscopic, others the size of dogs, many from depths previously thought too hostile for life, and these are just the species that get caught in nets, or captured on camera by remotely operated vehicles. The rest, Those who never surface, who live in trenches, who swim beneath the limits of our submersibles, remain unseen. They are not hypothetical. They are waiting in darkness, waiting in pressure, waiting in the folds of the Earth's greatest secret. And then there's the matter of scale, of size. Could an organism exist in the deep that is massive beyond anything we have classified? It seems unlikely, but not impossible. After all, the blue whale remained undiscovered in a scientific sense until the 20th century. And the colossal squid, a creature long dismissed as sailor's lore, was only first filmed alive in 2006. The idea that we have found everything worth finding in the sea is not just arrogant, it is demonstrably false. The ocean laughs at our certainties. It reminds us that our sample sizes are small, that our sensors are few, that our maps are often just approximations, and that most of our assumptions about what life can and can't do are based on surface rules. Rules that break down completely once you plunge below the photic zone into a world where the laws of nature seem to bend. So when we hear a sound like the bloop, deep, massive, biological in shape but inexplicable in origin, it should not surprise us. It should remind us that the world is not finished, that discovery is not over, that wonder is not a relic of the past but a tool for the future. The deep sea is not the setting for mystery. It is the mystery. It is the uncharted continent beneath our feet, the other half of the Earth we pretend doesn't exist because it is too big, too cold, too dark, too difficult to comprehend, and it is speaking, in pulses, in bloops, in groans, in the slow exhalations of creatures we have not yet met and tectonic forces we do not yet understand. The sea is not quiet. It never has been. It is just too strange for us to hear clearly, too weird for us to interpret. But not forever. With each year our tools improve, our maps sharpen, our vehicles dive deeper. And perhaps one day, not too far from now, we'll descend past the known ridges and enter a trench where something huge moves in the black. Something ancient, something loud, something alive. And in that moment, maybe the bloop will stop being a mystery and become a memory. A greeting we missed the first time, a sound that said, "I'm here. I've always been here. You just weren't listening yet." And now, dear listener, we come to the end, not of the mystery, but of our long and winding journey through it. So thank you truly for staying with me through all of it. If you're somehow still awake, I admire your stamina, or your insomnia. Either way, I hope these strange, soothing thoughts helped carry you a little further into the night, whether you're drifting off, folding laundry, or simply letting your mind wander with the lights out and the rest of the world asleep. If you haven't yet, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It helps more than you know, and it means I get to keep whispering strange stories to the next curious soul who stumbles in, wondering what that sound was and why it still matters. And if you feel like it, leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is. I always love seeing where in the world my little constellation of night owls has gathered. We've covered a lot tonight, ice and signal, mystery and meaning, and while the answers may not be clear, the questions still shimmer in the dark, inviting us to keep wondering. Good night. This has been The Midnight Inquiry. The